Let's kick this off. It is Open Hardware Month.
It
right
has
now.
been.
It has been.
And it is.
And
Yes. Nowhere celebrated harder.
This is you.
than
yeah,
here.
and nowadays, people they have their at. That's how people know how to get a hold of them.
Yeah.
So this is you on the tweets. But
true.
tell us a little bit about yourself.
So
For those who haven't watched every show that you've been on.
every show. So I am on the board of the Open Source Hardware Association, and the Open Source Hardware Association is an organization that was put together to kind of be the community clearinghouse for open source hardware. And the beginning of the Open Source Hardware Association, why this is such an important time of year, was a lot of people were running around saying, open source hardware, maybe it's a thing, maybe we don't know. And so a bunch of people came together and said, let's come up with a definition of open source hardware. And so there was this community-derived definition of open source hardware, and the Open Source Hardware Association, OSHWA, is the kind of the steward
The
of that
keeper,
definition,
yes.
the keeper of the definition.
They didn't make the definition, but they just pet it, feed it,
Yeah.
upgrade it, update it as necessary
Yeah,
to
we give it a
reflect.
little roof, and
Yeah,
so everything
yeah.
is
A
good.
little knitted jacket.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. With like LEDs and lights.
Yeah. Okay.
And so then also from that, the Open Hardware Summit grew out of it, which was a place for everyone in the community to come together in person. That's here in New York in March. And then the most recent initiative that we've done is the certification program, which is a program because a lot of people still use different, even though there's the community definition of open source hardware, sometimes someone will say, hey, this is open source hardware, and they don't mean what you would think open source hardware would be. And so what the certification does is it makes it easy to say, when I say open source hardware, I mean the community definition of open source hardware. And if you see someone using the certification logo, you know their definition of open source hardware is your definition of open source hardware.
Yeah, that's good because it's hardware and software. The open source. One of the jokes that we make is the words open source are used to mean a lot.
Yeah.
And when I went to I don't know if you were at the meeting 10 years ago when we did the definition meeting.
I was not.
No.
I was not, but
No, I have a blog post about
He has a
who
blog
was
post.
there.
I'm not on that list.
I scanned in the pamphlet because I knew this was a historic meeting.
It was.
Yeah, we'll talk about that soon.
Well, what was interesting is that the lawyer who was there, whose name is on the list, who I can't remember, I think he was from Creative Commons. He said something really important, and I think he was like really amazing and great at keeping everyone on topic because it's very easy to sort of be like, licenses. And he said, you have to communicate the intentions. And that's actually the most important thing. He's like, there's a legal structure, but you're not going to go to court over this. So communicate your intentions, and I think you'll find that people are happy. And the biggest struggle I see with open source communities is when, and also, communities that talk about safer sex, is when you don't communicate, people get unhappy.
Yeah.
Because it's you don't have expectations and consent for what people are doing with your hardware. So I thought that was really important because it's true. Like a lot of people, they'll say open source, but when you say, well, what do you mean by that? They're like, oh, well, I don't want anybody to make money off it. Well, that's not in the definition of open source.
I have all sorts of
So your
questions.
expectation, you're going to be really disappointed, and that happens. People put something on an open source license and say, wait a minute, what do you mean somebody made it and is selling it? And it's like, that's permitted. And they're like, I didn't mean that. It's like, well, your expectations,
Yeah.
what you thought were your expectations were not what their expectations were. You had this mismatch,
Yeah.
this impedance mismatch.
Yep.
So I think that is, and it's funny because it's not a legal structure, but it is the most important thing for an organization. I think what OSHWA does, which is so cool, is, yes, you're a lawyer, but you don't come in as a lawyer. You're coming in as like, let's set expectations.
Yeah.
What do people want, and how do they want people to interact with their hardware? And I think everyone becomes so much happier.
Yeah, I think that the legal part is important, but you're right, it's secondary, if not tertiary. The legal part is in the background. Quaternary, right? The legal part is in the background. If you get to the legal part, many things have gone wrong.
You're like, you're in court,
right.
like something.
Everyone's sad.
Everyone's like,
Yeah, if
nobody's
you end up in
happy.
court, things didn't work out.
Well, by definition, if you're in court, it means people, it's not
Right.
clear cut, right?
Right. And so the more you can do to be clear to people what you want, what your expectations are, and one of the ways that we think about it sometimes is make it easy for good actors to be good, right? Like it's so easy to spend time thinking like, well, what about this bad person and they did this and they did this and I need to like build all these defenses about it. The world is full of bad people.
And we
Focus on
talked
the
with
good
Bunny
people.
about this too. He
Yeah.
said, we don't know if the defense mechanisms that we've put in these licenses even match the enemy. Like, you don't know
Yeah.
until years later. And, GPL bumped into this. It's like they came up with the GPL and then they're like, oh, shoot, we actually did not expect cloud computing
Right.
and services. Back to the drawing board, you
Right.
know. So it's you don't know until you get to court. So
getting back to something
Why freak out?
that you both just said, one of the observations, since I've been doing a post a day
Yeah.
all month for Open Hardware Month,
Machine.
which we're going to talk about that, is I look back at like the mailing lists that helped get open source hardware going, some other open source lists, and exactly what you just said, and that's why I wanted this to be kind of a segment.
Yeah.
The things that help open source hardware is how can you make it easy for people who want to do open source hardware? Because one of the problems right now, and I think it was different 10 years ago, but Twitter is a good example.
Yeah.
So just like yesterday, someone was saying, oh, because you use Creative Commons, you're not really doing open source hardware. And the person doesn't make open source hardware. They're just like, snarking on the sidelines. And I think one of the things that people have good intentions talking about licensing and doing open hardware, but I guess at this point, now that I'm 10 years older, please don't make it punishing the people who want to do good. I feel like, it's like, well, okay, we're going to do stuff, we're going to put it in an open software license, OSI certified. Hardware doesn't really have any protections. We're going to talk about that in a minute,
Yep.
except for like trademark and patent.
Right.
And so if someone is saying like, here's what I want to do, my intention is to share it, please do not come down on them and say that they're not really doing open source hardware. One of the posts that I have is how people said that Lemoore doesn't do open source hardware because the firmware in the elevator isn't open source. I'm not kidding. These are emails we get, and what they're just insane or they're just trolling.
Yeah.
But the thing is, they're just trying to discourage someone from doing something good. So I think that's one of the things that if there could be not a do-over, but like lessons learned, sharing it with the next generation of people doing this, is if you're on a mailing list or if you're even in an event or if it's Discord now or if it's Twitter,
Yep.
if someone is actively needling you about your intentions, like tune out of that, because they're not, especially when they don't do hardware, especially
Right.
when they're not sharing anything, especially when they're probably a Russian bot. Like who knows?
Yeah.
And just like don't pay attention to that.
Yeah.
Too much.
Yeah. I mean, one of the reasons that we did the certification program was we had people coming to us and saying,
Yeah.
I want to do
Speaking
open
of-
source hardware. I think I'm doing it right, but I'm really worried.
Should I
that we're
certify
gonna
my
mess
project?
up- Right. I'm
don't know.
really worried we're going to mess up something and then we're going to get flamed. And so
People scare them. They're like, oh, you know what? Someone's going to take you to court. You're like, please do not discourage someone who just wants to share their
Exactly.
little power supply
Exactly.
with the world. Like,
Exactly.
stop it.
And so what we said is, look, if you certify your thing, you go through the process. It's free. It's a free process. What that means is OSHWA says that you are complying with the rules. And so if somebody comes after you and says, hey, you're not doing open source hardware, you're not doing it right, you can come to us and we'll say, look, we stand behind this
Yeah,
person.
they're doing it the right way.
This is
this is
happened.
as good as it's going to
Yeah.
get, given that not everything is
Yep.
open sourceable. We came with a definition, and these are the guidelines, and these are the expectations.
We're standing behind them, which
Yeah.
gives them a way to come into the community with a little bit, without having to say, I don't know who's going to be attacking
Yeah.
me from where.
Yeah.
So I wanted to keep the
That sucks.
the OSHWA.org site up most of the time while you're talking, because this resource is that good. This is something, this is something that I wish we had it, years ago, but we do now.
Yeah.
So right away, the first thing is, should I open source my hardware? And then you go through each thing. What's open source hardware? Why open source hardware? How do I make open source hardware? What is OSHWA certified? So you go into all those things. Then you have an FAQ where it's all those things that people are like, but what if?
patent. What's the cost?
It's as if you've read every mailing
It's
list,
as if,
and you're
it's
like,
as if we get questions.
it's as if you have questions.
And these are good questions. It's like, can I use non-open components, open
Yeah.
source hardware? This is a common thing.
And
People
then
say, well, your
get
chip
requirements.
isn't open source.
Right.
It's like, I don't have control over that,
Right.
And
Exactly.
then the other
What can
thing
I
is
do?
license agreement. You're kind of saying this is what I'm doing.
Yeah.
And I'm going to do a little bit of like open source history, but one thing that was really smart was there was a community logo that basically it's unownable.
Yeah.
The gear logo.
For all sorts of reasons.
All sorts of reasons. My
But you
opinion.
can read the blog post.
Yeah, I have a whole blog post about it. And you can read the whole story.
Right.
So there's the OSI logo,
Yep.
which is the keyhole, and then the community gear logo. my opinion is OSI, they got a little grabby and they could have worked it out and we could have all been using the Gear logo in an official capacity. They didn't. That's okay. Everyone uses the Gear logo still.
Yep.
However, you can't really do anything about it if someone puts the Gear logo on
We
something.
get
and it's
complaints
not.
all the time. They say,
Yeah.
"Can you? I see someone using the Gear logo wrong. Can you do anything about it?" And the
No.
answer is,
And like
You can email them and say,
So,
please don't.
yeah.
it's not too late. My I don't know if I'm gonna have time to do a wish list. My wish list would be to revisit the coexistence agreement with the OSI and to say, hey, maybe this is more ownable, and maybe they can donate it to Oshawa.
yeah,
So at least you'd have a little bit more teeth
yeah.
if something came up. So that's my wish, because all the people that made that decision are gone from
Yeah.
OSI. Anyways, that's on my wish list. But one of the things that you did too is talked about all the ways you can protect hardware.
Yeah.
One of the things, you can do branding. You can do
You need to think about this is great work by a bunch of law students at NYU and the clinic. They did an amazing job with this. And we said,
this is like
we said, look, how do you even approach this? Because when you're thinking about these rules, it needs to work for a jacket that is a light up jacket or a circuit express or everything in between.
Or mechanical engineering, or a 3D printer. It could be, there's a wide range.
Right.
With all sorts of different weird exceptions and rules and.
Exactly. And so trying to think, okay, on the highest level of abstraction, what are the pieces you're thinking about and what's the way to think about your ability to control them? Right? Can you even control them? And if so, what are the tools? And so they really did a great job of breaking this out into these different categories and saying, you're thinking about hardware, you're thinking about software, you're thinking about
I like that
documentation.
branding is separate because it's usually forgotten. Usually people are like, oh, hardware, software, firmware, CAD files, but they don't think about branding, which is a really important part of the puzzle. We release open source hardware, but we don't give people open permission to use the Adafruit logo and name. That's how we know that we made it, because that way we can support or replace products. We know, like, okay, that's ours. People can take our logo off and still fab the board, and that happens all the time, and that's
you
fine.
even have protectable, more protectable. You have all these different things.
Yeah.
So I thought we would maybe speed round a little bit of all the questions that I always see.
Yeah.
That you can answer.
Totally.
And I also want to make sure that people know this is not legal advice.
This is not legal advice.
So here we go.
Okay.
So I made hardware.
Yep.
And I want to make it open source.
Yes.
So I know what open source software is.
Yep.
I picked a license.
Yep.
Which software license should I pick?
I think it is a bad idea to use software licenses for hardware because software licenses are written with software in mind.
But what if
And
I have
so-
software for my hardware?
So if you have software, you're right. So if you have software, then any open source software license is going to be fine for open source.
OSI
hardware.
compliant.
OSI compliant software licenses are going to be great for the software.
Got it.
Yeah,
Okay.
and so just pick what your expectations
Yeah.
are. Do you want it to be GPL, so people have to contribute back changes? Or you can use MIT or BSD, they're more permissive.
Lady
There's
Ada,
tons
which one
of
do
it.
you use most of the time?
I tend to use MIT or BSD unless I have, sometimes there's requirements. If your firmware is using other people's firmware, like sometimes I use a library or code example, or I use firmware that it's based off of somebody else's code that's open source, and they have a GPL license, you're required to use a GPL
But
license.
you're doing this on your own, and you get
If
to
I
pick
write
whatever you want.
if I write it from scratch, I usually go with MIT or BSD because I think for firmware, it's hard. The distribution is complicated. I figure you might as well make it just permissive.
Okay, got it. So far, I have this open source hardware design. I have software that goes with it, and I've decided an MIT license for me. Great. Now I designed it in Eagle. Does that mean it's never open source because Eagle's not open source?
Never
Is
be
that-
open source. No, you have to make
Oh.
you make the files available. The
Okay.
idea
I don't have to use
is
KiCad.
no, you
I
can
can
You
use
can
Eagle.
if you want.
Okay,
You
I
can
can
use
use
what you
any
want.
tool I want.
You can use Altium.
Yeah, use whatever you want. As long as you distribute the files in a format that many people can access and can manipulate,
Got it.
then you're fine. And
Okay.
this is one of these things that's an ongoing conversation, and it tends to be community specific.
Yeah.
But if the community expectation, not just sort of the open source hardware community, but the kind of narrower community that's tied to whatever you're talking about,
it.
if they see that if they see whatever you used as a sort of generally available tool,
Yeah.
then it's usually fine. I mean, this is how we think about components too, right? If it's generally available without having to sign an NDA or some other ridiculous agreement,
Yeah.
that means it's generally available.
I mean, I remember the Intel Galileo. It was OrCAD, and I had to download an OrCAD installer, but you could get one. It's free. There's a viewer. You can't edit the file, but you can view it. You install it. It's like kind of destroyed my computer, but then I could view these files, and I was like, this is fair. Like I can actually see it. I don't know OrCAD, but even though it was distributed in this format I've never used before,
So for
it was available.
Adafruit, which does open source hardware, you publish the EagleCAD files, and what license? Because this is now we're in the crazy territory. Oh wait, let me just before we get into the crazy territory.
Yeah.
So let's say if I use KiCad, open source CAD tool,
Totally.
but I use it on Windows.
Yeah. Still okay.
Am I not open? Oh, I am
Still
open
okay.
source.
Still okay.
And if I take an elevator and the firmware is not open, I'm okay.
The soldering iron is
Then it all falls apart.
It all falls
You were
apart.
fine until you got in the elevator.
So before we
take the
move
stairs.
before we move on to
Build those legs.
the license for the files.
Yeah.
So if I were to use EagleCAD and I put up my files and I have the software license for the software, it seems like it'd be cool if you could use a tool like EagleCAD and export the files to something else too. And just a little bit of kudos to CADsoft. They're now Autodesk. But open source hardware started to take off a lot, and because it did, they asked a few of us what would be helpful, and EagleCAD got an XML export. So it was, I want to make sure people don't forget these things, and I put it in blog posts. They actually listened to us, and we said, there's a lot of people arguing about the file format. If you could export out of Eagle, that would calm that one guy.
Because it was binary format.
And they did.
They were good. We got a bunch of questions where people were using educational licenses of Eagle, and they were worried that because they were making their files available for free, which means someone could use them commercially, that they, as the creator, were going to be violating the terms.
Yeah.
And we reached out to them, and they wrote back, which, lawyering is
Usually,
scary.
yeah.
It's scary to write it down.
Oh no, legal decision.
And they wrote back, and they said, no, we think this is totally fine.
Yeah.
And it's like a huge kudos to them. For
because they could have easily said like, "What? No, what are you doing?" But they said
we're going to be ambiguous and reserve the right.
That's cool.
So
Wendell and Lenore from Evil Mad Scientists helped us out with that. So it was Lenore, Wendell, Lamore, and myself, and we did a call with EagleCAD when it was CADsoft. Then months later, they had a new update and they had XML export.
Yeah.
And now they're part of Autodesk. And now it's still it's not the end of the world if you decide on a tool. Like you could still kind of do stuff.
KiCad or KiCad and Eagle, it can import Eagle files. There's converters between the two. It's not like text where there's an open ASCII format. There's no open format for CAD file. Every CAD software is totally different. So there's converters, some people will actually redraw the design. I mean, I think that's life. I mean, that it's when you create a file, when you create a 3D file, you can export to like a DWG or whatever, or a step file, but that's not the original format you're editing in.
Yeah.
It's usually a different format, and that's normal.
Okay, now I'm almost to the tough question, I think.
Yeah.
Ooh.
So before we get to the tough question, because I'm about to put these files up online.
Yeah.
But before I put these files up online, I think we should do a little side quest. What are the protections for things? I know there's patents.
Yep.
There's trademarks.
Yep.
And there's copyrights. Does
Yep.
any of those cover these hardware designs that I want to put away?
Yeah, I mean, the answer is the lawyer answer, which is maybe.
Yeah,
it depends.
Right? I mean, the way to think about it is the trademarks are all about the name you put on it. The trademarks are for users to be able to know who the source of the thing is.
Okay, so when we put our Adafruit logo on it, so that's a trademark on the board.
I know it was made in New York. I know it was made by YouTube.
Okay.
If something goes wrong, I can come back to you.
But the trademark only covers that name and logo.
Right.
It's not like you can't
It's just
trademark.
a source indicator.
You can't trademark a board or you can't trademark a schematic. It's not.
You just can't make essentially a counterfeit of it with our logo on it.
Right, because the logo would trick someone into thinking that you were the source of a board and it wasn't.
Yeah, trademark is just the name, logo,
A
graphic.
good practice would be to put a registered trademark logo on our board. Still could be open source.
Totally.
Still do whatever you want. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
so
that's one
Look at all these
form.
trademark things.
That's one form of protection that would help people against counterfeits, but not the design itself.
Right. So
Okay. Well, what about a patent?
Right. So if you think about patents and you think about copyright, you think about two separate universes, at least at the beginning.
Yeah.
Right. There's the universe of patents, which are things that are functional that engineers make, and there are things that are copyrightable that are things that lawyers think creative people make. So software falls in the copyright space, but everything else it's sort of sortable as sculpture is copyright, a novel is copyright,
Yeah.
but a 3D printer, right, a mechanical object, a functional object, that's in the patent category. And so the reason that distinction matters, right, is you sort of sort that world into things you hire engineers to make and things you hire kind of artists to make. And
Yeah.
just accept that distinction for a minute. I know
Yeah,
it's problematic. Is copyright is automatic. So if you make a thing that's in the copyright world, you automatically protect it.
So code is always in that.
Right. It's
Yeah,
born
kinda like a song.
It's born closed, right? It's born wrapped up
Because
in copyright.
it's a derivative of text. It's just a weird.
Yeah, there's like this weird one.
There was a decision that was made in the
We
90s.
all
that
agree it's kind of like
code
writing the
is-
story.
Yeah.
Code, even though it's not a story, it is textual and it's copyright.
Okay.
Exactly.
kinda weird, but-
Exactly. It's kind of weird. It's like
And logos are
weird.
logos.
But
That makes sense.
It's,
Like
it's
Yeah.
law.
I
It's
can't,
done.
I can't put a Nike logo on a board
Right.
because that's their logo.
That's their logo,
Got
and
it.
you would confuse people as
Yeah,
to
they'd be like,
where
why is
the
Nike
source
making all this
Right.
cool hardware?
Right.
That would
Maybe
be
it'll be
cool.
good.
Okay, so
And then on the patent side, patents are not automatic. So if you are dealing with something that's in the patent category, it's born free, it's born open.
yeah,
And if you're the creator, you can take steps to get a patent and try and close it up, but you have to try. And so it's super relevant for people who are doing hardware at home or even in small scale businesses because copyrights are free and automatic. So you're going to have all the things that are copyrightable are going to be protected by copyright.
and that's just the code.
And the code is, the
Yeah.
licensing is super important. If it's the functional stuff, unless you're willing to pay $30,000 to get a
Yeah.
patent, it's probably not going to be protected at all.
And even then, the patent process, it becomes very narrow.
Yeah.
It's like what you can patent is it's a sliver of something, and it's not going to be like the whole machine. It is like the process by which you extrude plastic, and you
Yeah.
have to prove
And
that
I-
you're the first person to
I'd
do
say
it.
the physical hardware doesn't
That's
even
hard.
matter as much because something could have a patent and there could be many different ways to do it.
Exactly.
And the patent is just like, who cares if your board was made with this or if it used this component? It still does that thing that we patent and don't use. don't do
Totally.
it. So
Totally.
this is the hard part. This is where I think
Right.
everyone kind of they break. So I have these design files.
Yep.
So surely there must be a hardware license because I
Right.
have a software license for code.
Totally.
What type of hardware license do I have?
And so the answer is there are a couple of hardware licenses that have been pulled together. There's the CERN licenses are really fantastic.
Yeah, CERN who makes these
Who makes the hydrogen collider? Yeah,
the giant,
the giant. We're
the
gonna
giant
black
particle
hole
collider.
in-
Okay,
yeah,
so
in-
they have a bunch of people that can
Yeah.
work on this.
Yes,
Okay, so
yes.
they're probably one of the first choices if you're going to start doing open source hardware now, and you're looking
Yes.
for a hardware license.
Yes.
That a bunch of people have been hammering on.
Yes,
Okay.
but I think it's really important when you're thinking about hardware licenses. Going back to what we were talking about before, hardware licenses are really about good actors.
Okay.
Because with software, you definitely you own some IP, you own the copyright, and so you have the ability to control other people. Because you have a hammer, you can go after them with
Yeah.
copyright infringement. With hardware, you might have IP, you might not. So what the licenses are really doing is clearing out barriers to good actors.
Yeah.
Because you're saying, look, if you want to do these things, I'm communicating my expectations, here are my rules, I'm going to get any hidden traps out of the way.
Yeah.
And it'll depend on the hardware whether or not if a bad person came in and broke the rule you're trying to set up.
This is a
you could
permissive,
sue
not
them.
defensive
Yeah,
position.
yeah. It's
Whereas
getting out of the way.
open source software licenses are defensive, not permissive.
Yeah.
Because you're giving away something that you have, which is that copyright. You're giving it. With hardware, there is no protection that you natively have. You're just setting up your well, you may or may not have. You're setting up the expectations that like, okay, if you make this, I'm not going to get a patent afterwards and then
Right.
punish you for it.
Right.
Okay, and let me get something out of the way. So this always comes up. I don't want to do open source because someone's going to take it. Well, so here's the thing. Apple does not do open source hardware. You can buy an exact duplicate of an iPhone pretty much anywhere in the world and or from your home and get it delivered to you. So the fact that they didn't put up their files didn't change it.
Nope.
So don't think that you're going to have this magical wand that protects you from everything. And there's a couple of questions in the
That's
chat.
another
we'll
thing.
get to.
If you put out hardware and you say, hey, this is non-commercial, you actually have no legal standing to defend against it.
Right.
Which is very unfortunate for people. I think it's good to put your expectations, but just be aware it's you can only give people permission. You can't defend against
Yeah.
bad actors.
Right.
So CERN is I think the most durable one. There's Tapper, there's SolverPad.
Yeah, which are great, but they're
And what we use, because we're not stuck with it, but we've just been doing it for so long, so we use Creative Commons
Yep.
share alike attribution.
Yep.
And that was because at the time it was like, well, these are kind of like little works of art.
Yeah.
And we were posting like the schematics on Flickr, and that
Right.
had a Creative Commons license.
Totally.
And we're all like, okay, so, and PDFs were in
Well,
Creative
it's
Commons
also
license.
like, it's very clear the expectations, right? Because it's another thing, it's like the CERN license. I mean, I think it's a good license, but I think
Yeah.
with hardware, again, because it's a permissiveness thing, it's like I'm just telling people what you can do, and what I would like, which is, please credit. I would prefer that. Just don't, if you don't want to credit, design your own stuff or be a jerk. So I use that because I think it's really easy. It's like attribution, share alike, very clear what the expectations are.
Well, and the other thing that it does, and this is where things get weird, right? With hardware, you have to think about the difference between the documentation and the
Yeah.
hardware itself, right? So if you're licensing
Yeah,
your documentation, your
Yes.
file,
The schematic is the documentation.
Yeah, well,
Right.
this
And
site
that's what you're allowed to
here,
do.
yeah, like your site, this site here is Creative Commons.
Right.
You can share alike. And
Yeah.
so that's kind of what we went with design files. Where,
Totally.
like it's kind of like the documentation sort of.
Exactly.
So it's
It's
like,
exactly
well,
what it is.
we'll
Yeah.
use Creative Commons.
and it's fine. And that says like if you want to make copies of these files, these are the rules.
Yeah. So it sounds like, because now, we're part of a story. Software's taken care of. This
Yeah.
has been tested before, OSI compatible license. Most people, and I'm just going to go into like, okay, what's actually happening. Most people use an MIT license for the software.
Yep.
And for the hardware, most people who are shipping open source hardware right now, they use a Creative Commons share alike attribution license. And that covers Adafruit, we do that. SparkFun does that. Arduino does that. So if you get an Arduino board and you want to look at the code, it's under an MIT license on GitHub. And if you download this Eagle files or the schematic, look in the corner, it's Creative Commons share alike attribution.
Yep, which is
and
great.
now that covers just those three companies alone. That's millions and millions of units.
Yep.
And so far, there has been a court case that's tested this.
Yep.
That's kind of interesting. Just a
Yeah.
little side note.
Yeah.
No court case. So once you get these files, where do you put them? Like, where would you put these open source code, and where would you put the design files?
I think it's important you put them up somewhere that it's accessible to everyone. But where you put it beyond that is not super.
Doesn't have to be
important.
GitHub.
Doesn't have to be GitHub.
It can be a
It can be
media,
anywhere
it
you
can be a
want.
blog.
Yeah, it can be on some server that
Some
you're
people
hosting.
put their design files on Imager, and I'm like, that's cool.
Yeah,
You can put it all up in a zip.
yeah. As long as it's somewhere that people can actually access it, that's fine. I mean, you look at if you follow the links for the certification stuff, people have things on all random corners of the internet,
Yeah.
and that's totally fine. Because the important thing is to put it somewhere that's part of your workflow, because you want that documentation to be up to date.
Yeah.
And if you make it available where you are accessing it, it's going to be the best files.
Yeah. That's
Okay.
cool. I like how you're just like, well, let's do what's easiest and best for the person sharing.
Yeah.
Instead of like, it must be on the offshore server. It's like, you're like, I don't want to serve your files.
When we built this, we were very intentional. We had no interest in building like a new GitHub or a new this. We said, go wherever you want. Tell us where it is, and we'll point to it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's
I
what
think
we're doing.
one of the things in open source hardware history, and I'm out of days, so I can't cover all of it, that I wanted to write about is there was a kind of like a almost yearly celebration in my inbox of, hi, we're building the GitHub for hardware. And there was people who wanted to make licenses and to have this GitHub for hardware, and they wanted to charge a fee, and they wanted to just grab all the open source hardware files and you'd use their site. Luckily, that all kind of went away.
Yeah.
I don't see that as often. We don't get the pitch that
There's a new one, but it's very rare.
Yeah.
There's a couple years in between
and
this latest one.
turns out, right now, again, this is not a recommendation, this is observation. Most people doing open source hardware, shipping it, running a business around it, they put their files and their code up on GitHub.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Only because that's a place where they can do pull request issues, and it's a server that's always kind of up.
That's what their workflow is,
Yeah.
and so it's the best place for them.
Yeah.
Yeah, but some people use GitLab and some people do something else, and I think that's totally cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I'm being really clear. This isn't a recommendation.
No,
this
no,
is
it's
just
just,
an observation.
it is the most common, but there's lots of places.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to do a question from the chat, which is a good one. For makers who are private individuals not associated with a business entity and who aren't interested in selling but just wanting to share openly, is there any legal protection steps that should be observed?
I think this is where enabling good actors becomes really important, because there are a lot of people who say, I want to share, I want to invite people
So
to use this
whoever's
stuff.
asking this,
Yeah.
make sure you put exactly the license,
Yes,
exactly
yes,
what you want
yes.
done with it.
Because
Yeah.
you want to make sure that you aren't by mistake leaving a barrier in place for somebody.
Got it.
You want to just clear out that's what those licenses do. They say, look, I'm telling you I want you to use this, and I'm removing any traps that I might have inadvertently left.
Got it. So next up, and I'll put my opinion in this. So there was a non-commercial option for Tapper, and that was not a good idea. And there's also a non-commercial option for Creative Commons. That's also a bad idea. I think that
And that has been legally, that's gone to court, that's Creative
been-
Commons.
Yeah.
It's
So-
been hard to define.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think I would say if you have the temptation to put your open source hardware under a non-commercial license that's not open source hardware, don't do that. And I've seen this where people they'll put the software under an open license and then say, but the hardware is non-commercial under a non-commercial hardware
Yeah,
fake license or that they made up, or
Yep.
it's like Creative Commons non-commercial.
Yep.
Which is, it's unclear to me if that's even possible to be true.
right.
'Cause,
And,
like,
and if let's pretend it was true, if you have the software out there, someone will build compatible hardware. And
yeah. Then what?
then like you've done nothing. So again, all you've done is you put a barrier up for good faith actors, and you've done very little to stop bad faith actors.
Yeah.
And you'll be disappointed when your expectations don't meet your ability to control it.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen projects that are non-commercial or non-open and they get cloned, and then what? Like what, there's really no recourse you have, because, you can look at a schematic. I mean, a lot of schematics are from the data sheets anyway. Somebody can redraw it in their own, favorite CAD editor, and then they're remaking it. Just like people they look at 3D models, they just look at it and they're like, oh, I see what you did, and they just redraw it themselves.
Okay, next question. No legal advice, but is license delusion a thing? If one line of 1,000 is GPL, do I still have to release my code? If I later remove that one line, how does that work? If something is 25% GPL code and 75% MIT, who wins? This is like the Git repo of Jesus here. Okay. How do you navigate that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that once GPL is in there, then you are using it, you are copying it, and so if you want to copy it without infringing, you have an obligation to comply with the rules, which means if it's GPL, it's GPL.
Got it.
And so as long as GPL is in there, if you want to really comply with the rules, you have to make everything GPL.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Good answer. All right. So with all that being said, sounds like
This is not legal advice, however.
It's just generally speaking,
Just generally speaking.
there's always asterisks and like curly cues and things,
Yeah,
but
sure.
that's
Make
the
that
way.
sense.
That's just the way to kind of think about it to start.
yeah.
I think it's always good to like bookmark your speech with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yes. Thank you.
So right now, sounds like I have all the pieces together. I have a trademark for my
Yeah.
brand. I put it on the board.
Yep.
I've decided to do open source software. I got an MIT license on that. I've used KiCad, and I'm going to put it under a Creative Commons share-alike attribution, or maybe I'll use CERN next time. Cool, and
Yeah.
I'll use that. And
You
I
use both.
I document. Yeah, I document that. And I put it in whatever repo I want. I put it up there. Great. I'm now selling this stuff. Cool. I'm selling on Tindy. Maybe I've made a bunch. I'm selling
Crowd
through
supply.
Adafruit. Now, let's say I see on a website someone took the exact everything and they made it.
Yeah.
What do I do? Has my logo on it.
So then you have a choice.
What do I do?
You have a choice. Whether
This is not
it's
legal
worth-
advice.
This is,
No,
no,
it's not legal advice.
the choice is it's going to cost you some amount of money to go after that person if they've broken the rules, and if they have your logo on it, that's a huge problem.
Yeah.
And so you probably have the ability to go after them.
Okay, so if the logo's on it,
The question is,
that's not okay.
That's not
But
okay.
if the logo's not on it,
Then they may not be breaking any rules.
it's probably okay.
It's probably okay.
Got
And so
it.
then what you do is you go to your community and say, we are working hard for you, and so look for things that have our logo on it.
Got it. Now, if I decided to certify my open source hardware through OSHWA,
Yep.
and I use the OSHWA logo
Yep.
on it, and I see that they did that,
Yeah.
could I talk to OSHWA?
Yes.
And say, hey, they're using my logo,
Yep.
and they're using your logo.
Yep.
that I got
Double
certified
logo.
for.
Yep.
Can you help me out with this?
And then the answer is absolutely yes,
Ah,
because
okay.
if you go through the certification process, you have the right to use the logo,
Right.
but they don't have the right to use the logo. So then it's an OSHWA problem. And so then we will go after them
Yeah.
and say, hey, you can't use our logo unless you've gone through the certification process.
So
And they're lawyers.
Yeah.
well,
And they can write those emails that are like, govern
Nasty
yourself
emails.
accordingly.
yeah,
well,
exactly.
So I think
Many syllables.
Yeah, so I think I'm in a better position to give advice than you are.
Yeah.
Because you're a lawyer.
Yeah.
So here's what I think. So if you're thinking of doing open source hardware, folks, go through the OSHA certification and put the logo on it, because if you're really worried about counterfeits, you would at least have a bunch of people who could help you.
You have
If-
another
If
person
you
to
just
help
put
you.
your logo on it, you're on your own. You
Yeah.
are.
Yeah.
And so it is a free way to have some people probably care about what's happening to you.
Yeah, and we'll care a lot.
Yeah.
And we have conversations like that all the time.
So these 335 projects are allowed to put the OSHWA logo on it. And Adafruit's here. Look at that. Yay.
Yeah.
You know what's great about having A in your company name? You usually get it stuff. So what's cool, and this is something that I think more people should do, because they're like, well, what if someone just clones it? I don't care, I don't care about that, but like I wouldn't want to see my company name out there. I'm not going to get a lawyer, but if they put the OSHWA logo on, if someone's going to be lazy and just counterfeit the board, they're going to
Yeah, right,
they're
they're
going to
gonna do the whole
counterfeit the OSHWA logo too.
Yep.
So that's my advice to folks. If you're thinking about it,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah,
a thing to do.
totally.
So you have 335 projects on this site. Looks like every type of project from around the world.
Yeah, we've got from over 30 countries now. We've
Wow.
got people coming in. We have, it's all
And that's
over the place.
and that's how when you see like IN, that's from India.
Yep.
Maybe
US is US.
Netherlands.
Where
What is
is
BG?
Bulgaria.
Bulgaria?
Bulgaria
That's
is
cool.
a star.
Yeah.
You
Oh,
had, you
yeah?
had a piece about this.
Yeah.
Bulgaria probably has the highest per capita open source hardware certification
Oh, man.
of any country. in
Come
the
on,
world.
America.
I think BG is up to 50.
Dude,
It's amazing.
that's epic. All right,
yeah, we
cool.
wrote about electronic cats from Mexico.
Yep.
And like right now, they're one of my favorite open source hardware companies. One, they're new.
Yep.
They're coming in, and all of us have gone through so much stuff. They can kind of just whoop, like they don't have to worry about anything. They're like, oh, cool, we're just gonna like,
They learn the lessons.
yeah, they're just gonna be like, cool, we're just gonna make hardware. They don't have to worry about all the stuff. They have this cool board that looks like a cat.
Yep.
And they're like, oh, great, I could just put Arduino on it or CircuitPython.
Right.
Oh, wonderful.
Great.
Like this is what you want to see. And they're
Exactly.
young, and they're from another country, and they're cranking out hardware. There's like they have a satellite, they have LoRa stuff, they have educational stuff,
Yeah.
they have robots, and they didn't have to go through like what's open source hardware and all this stuff. The other one that I wrote about was Olemex.
Yeah.
They've been doing
Bulgaria.
really advanced. Yeah, Bulgaria. They've been doing really advanced
Kicking our ass.
open source hardware.
Yeah.
Another one that I wrote about was Prusa.
Yeah.
And I emailed Prusa and I said, hey, how many printers do you have? And they wrote back 150,000. There's 150,000 open source hardware printers in the world. And if you told me 10 years ago or 5 years ago
Yeah.
that the most popular 3D printer was going to be an open source one, I'd be like, I hope. But at the time, it didn't look like that.
No.
Like MakerBot started open, went closed, and then now people aren't. You don't hear about MakerBot.
Yep.
Lulzbot, I think they're having some company problems. Then there's all of the other really big companies. But Prusa, they have 300 people. They're in the Guinness World Book of Records for most 3D prints at the same time. And they're just
Important.
and
They're killing
It's like they're very American.
and the founder has an open source hardware gear
He sure
tattooed.
does.
So he's stuck.
You're right. He's
He
there.
can't just be like, oh, you know what?
Not so much.
Non-commercial. He'd have to get another tattoo.
Yeah.
So I think that was one of the surprising things that I looked at this month of what's been happening.
Yeah.
For the last 10 years is like you wouldn't have expected it.
Well, the thing that I love about the Prusa stuff is there were late entrants to that market.
Yeah.
Right? Like they're an open source hardware company. They were not the first open source hardware 3D printer. There were a lot of desktop 3D printers when
Yeah, they came
decided,
from RepRap.
Yeah. But they came
Like a
in
bunch of them
and
did.
they just said, we're going to do this really well. We're going to be really deeply connected to our community.
Yeah.
And they show that you can totally
It's
do
just,
that.
and it's like slogged. I love it. It's just like every day. They just do a little bit every day.
Yeah.
And it adds up.
Yeah.
Okay. So a couple other odds and ends here. If folks are watching this and they're like, oh my God, this sounds like a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Cool community, 3D printers.
How can I join in?
I can go to every country
Yeah.
and probably visit someone who's doing open
Yeah,
source hardware.
totally.
Bulgaria,
Bulgaria.
Netherlands.
It sounds like it might be time for an event. what event is coming up where people could celebrate all this stuff
What if there
together?
was a thing?
Oh,
Oh, look at that. The Open
Yeah.
Hardware Summit, the 10th anniversary Open Hardware Summit. It's going to be here in New York on March 14th.
hey, look, we're a sponsor.
Look at that.
That's
Yay.
disclose it. We're a sponsor of
Yeah.
this.
This is my favorite event of the year. I love this event. This is a place for everyone who's doing this stuff to get together.
Not LawyerCon or
Not
Lawyer
LawyerCon.
Palooza?
I know. It's no LawyerCon.
We went to LawyerCon. That's fun. No, we did. We went to LawyerCon.
Yeah.
It was cool.
There are many delightful lawyer conferences.
Okay,
but
but
this
you like
is a
this
place
one.
to come and see. I mean, it's sort of this combination of seeing what people are doing and just sort of be inspired by it, but then also people talk about their struggles and the things they've worked through and lessons learned. And so if you come, you can jump, you can skip all of the stages that you had to go through and say, oh well, if this is how they're doing it, then I'll do it that way instead of doing it the 5 wrong ways first and
Yeah.
jump up to it. And so I love it. I find it to be a totally inspirational, reinvigorating event every year. I'm super excited it's back in New York, which is where it
It's
started.
kind of great. It's not lawyer because it's like, fuck it. We're just going to do this thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
We're gonna
Okay,
make it
another
happen.
question from the chat since we talked about proofs of printers. Can people make their own if they wanted to?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the
and they
thing.
probably will love it,
Yeah.
right? And
They
so-
have kits, and then, I'm sure people make their own and
Sure.
adapt them and modify them and, like, attach different hot ends, and I'm sure that's part of the community hacking.
Yeah, and they probably contribute it back. They probably write in and say, we made this thing better, we made this change, and then they integrate it into the next version.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful thing.
Beautiful
Okay.
thing.
Okay. Other odds and ends.
All right, so go to this thing March next year
Next year.
Yeah.
here in New York.
Okay.
Yes.
I'll probably
Um,
be there.
Yeah.
I might be speaking or something. I don't know.
Well, you kicked off the first one. We
I
posted up
did.
your keynote for one
I
of the
did the
posts
first
of
talk,
open.
or second or
source
third
hardware.
talk at the first
Yeah.
conference.
Okay, so I had a couple questions for you
Yeah.
since we're coming up at the end of the hour here.
Yeah.
Since you have, I think, the bird-eyed view of all these projects.
Yeah.
What projects aren't you seeing that you'd like to see certified as open source hardware?
I'd like to see more things that don't, I think of a category of things as like things that require soldering.
Okay.
I'd like to see more things that don't require soldering. Not because I don't love the things that require
Yeah.
soldering or the things that require batteries, but I love that the community is broader than that. And,
Gotcha.
and I like to see those things come in.
Do you have any examples of something that you
We
have
had
seen?
somebody who open sourced. It was like a super artistic business card holder that was
Okay.
made out of this very elaborate concrete, and it made me so happy because it was just a thing
Yeah.
that I didn't expect, and that somebody came in and did. And so I love that. I love
Yeah.
the wearables things. I think this is in the soldering category, but I think people are doing amazing things with the wearables, and being able to showcase them on the site would be really fantastic and make me really happy. And then
There's a category, wearables.
yeah, and then just like all the things that are connected with art also make me happy. And there's this whole group of things that are kind
Cyborg
of
rig.
sound related, that do all these sort of sound distortions or do ambient sounds.
You got arts.
That I think they're just great projects. And so
Stomp boxes. Okay, they're a concrete business card holder.
yeah,
All right.
it's crazy.
Mixie pipe. That sounds fun too.
Yeah.
All right. Well, these are cool projects.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Bunny was here, and I asked Bunny, what he wants to see open sourced. He was saying it'd be great to, move beyond many of the hobby projects. And his next effort is to do inspection of electronics after you get them with off-the-shelf tools. Because you hear
Yeah.
about these in-plant and hack devices and all that. So an easy way to use like a USB microscope, be able to inspect all this stuff, and that system itself would be open source. Like we do visual inspection on the boards, and
Yeah,
the pick-and-place
right.
machine does that. But you don't really know what's happened to those electronics in that software. So you have to be able to do a bunch of tests. So he was working on that.
Yep.
Yeah.
One of the things, and I think this might end up not starting in the U.S., but I could see it happening elsewhere first, and then maybe we'll try to do it. Voting machines, because voting machines, who cares? Like, it should be whoever wants to make them can make them, but they have to be open source and certified and tested.
Yep.
And if you want to invest the money and make a company that does voting machines,
Yep.
you can corner the market, but they have to be inspectable, and right now they're not. And
Yeah,
that's the
there's
problem.
there's a project to try and build open source voting tool chain, and one of the things I think it's a great example of is not only does it matter if the design is open, but if you're doing like a voting machine, you care who made it. right? So
Yeah.
the company, it's like, well, anybody could then just make it. How could you build a company on that? It's like, no. I want the design to be right, but I also want to trust the manufacturer. And that's where that trademark part comes in again, right? The design can be totally open, but someone can still corner the market by being the manufacturer that you actually trust
Yeah,
to
and
make that
if the
machine.
let's say the hardware design was on GitHub and
Yeah.
the software, you would have an entire
Oh, yeah.
population of people looking at that and improving and making better and making sure it can't be tampered with.
100%.
Like you'd have the biggest amount of free labor in the
Oh, yeah.
history, and like all the developers at all these companies, they're starting to care about what their code is being used for.
Yeah.
And it's like, hey, I don't want it used for this. I don't want it used for that.
Yep.
So I think that energy could additionally be devoted to, well, we have an issue with maybe voter fraud.
Yep.
We have an issue with tampering, or
Yep.
just most of the time, it's probably these machines are terrible
Yes.
and they're closed source and you'd never know.
Yep.
And it'd
There's
be
two
nice.
vendors and nobody is competing on it.
It would be nice to have something like that. I read someone tweeted this, and I'm gonna check and make sure it's true, but it was from a journalist with a blue check, and it was like, CNN or MSNBC, or they said that we spend $300 million on pet costumes a year,
Yeah.
but we don't. That's not the entire market of voting machine
Yeah.
revenue.
Yes.
So the little hot dog costume that makes the dog look like a hot dog is super cute.
Yeah.
However, we probably should make democracy work a little bit better too. So
Yes.
I'm not saying get rid of the dog costumes.
No.
What I'm saying
This is
is
a benchmark
What I'm saying
for
is,
spending.
to me, it seems like a really big opportunity, and I don't think it's going to start in the U.S. I think it might start somewhere else, where they're leapfrogging decades or even hundreds of years of how they used to vote.
Yep.
And they might just go, you know what, we're going to do open source voting machines.
Yep.
And here's the files, here's the source code.
Yep.
Tell us what we messed up. Good
Yep.
luck. And the bidder or the person who wants to make these machines in that country, go for it.
Yep.
And may the best company win.
Absolutely.
And I think that's one that I've been trying to figure out how it's going to happen for like the last 10 years. It's been on my list.
Yeah.
Medical equipment, I think that's one of the ones too, especially as we're controlling more things over the internet.
Yeah.
And they're connected to our bodies. Probably should be inspectable
Yep.
in some way.
Yep.
Should be more open than like,
Yeah.
it's a Java applet that keeps your heart going. Like,
Yes.
no.
Yes,
I don't
and being
want
able
that.
to, and then not only inspect it to see if it works, but then be able to access the data.
Yeah.
Right. If you have something implanted in you and it's sending out data about you, at a minimum, you should be able to access that data too, and that's
Yeah.
where that openness comes in.
Okay, well, if folks want to see an entire month of posts,
Man.
so Crowd Supply, I emailed them. They built their business on open source hardware and openness. Tindy, they sell most of their stuff, and it happens to be open source
You
hardware.
can search Tindy by certified open source hardware.
That's right. Jasmine, who's the project manager, said they just added that as a feature.
Yeah.
See, I think that's another thing. Why would you do open source? Well, you might get a giant community of people who want to buy it.
Yep.
Bunny stopped by, chatted with Chris Anderson from DIY Drones.
Yep.
He had an interesting thing. He said the problem for them is there's so many clones that it's hard to support.
But
And-
also, they don't. People don't know what they're running. I think
Yeah.
it's
But it wasn't an open source problem.
not that it's open source. It could be a documentation branding
And,
issue.
Yeah, and I put a comment in there. If there is a trademark for Pixhawk, you can enforce that, and
Yeah.
you could stop those sales. It does require effort, though.
Yes, but it requires effort if you're open or closed.
Yeah.
Right. It's
Yeah.
not. That's not an open issue.
Yeah, Olimex, some of the most advanced open source hardware. One of my favorites, Electronic Cats. We saw the Department of Homeland Security had a flashlight that they would shine at protesters to make them throw up. So we saw that in an event. So we made an open source version, and we posted up how to do it. And so it flashes.
Does it work?
Well,
Watch the video.
I throw up in the video. Maybe that's the reason. Evil Mad Scientists, they've always kind of been like the gold standard. When they say something is open source, it's open source.
Yeah.
We spotlighted MicroPython, which not only got us all here doing Python on microcontrollers,
Yeah.
but the Pi boards.
I was
open
using it
source.
this weekend.
Yeah. You did a talk on Hackaday
Yeah.
chat.
That was
on
so much
Hack
fun.
Chat.
Yeah.
Parallax, they were one of the first, I'd say, old school electronics company that then joined in the open source community. And I asked Ken if he had any photos, Ken, the CEO. I believe they were the first ones to put the Gear logo on printed retail packaging because they had stuff in Radio Shack.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I
They also
mentioned that
open sourced
there.
the propeller one, I
Yeah,
think.
they
Yeah.
did. Prusa, I put there how many people out there in the world have
Yeah.
Prusas. One time we were in a meeting and there was some VC guy and he was quoting off numbers about Arduinos and Raspberry Pi. And I said, hey, those aren't right. And he's like, no, I got, these are right. I looked them up. I'm like, you're looking at my article. So it was kind of funny because he
Like
was
2 years ago.
Yeah,
Right.
he's like, no, these are the numbers. I'm like, it's my article.
Right.
I'm the one who asked them. You can't. It's on your screen. That's my name. So, anyways, this is another one. Sean Heimel did a talk. It was about growing your open hardware business, open source hardware in the modern
MoMA, yeah.
in MoMA.
It's
Little
legit.
bits.
It's
Right
legit.
now.
Little Bits is in there right
Today.
now. I believe, so Arduino I wanted to try to figure out exactly. So in the permanent collection, Little Bits is there.
Yeah.
There was an Arduino exhibit, but it's not in the permanent collection. So it's, at MoMA, they keep something forever. 'cause
Right.
Permanent
Yep.
is kind of permanent.
Right.
So Little Bits is going to be there in the permanent collection. Arduino had a showing there. So those are the two open source hardware products
So
that have
far.
been in the museum so far.
Yeah.
Here's the different licenses.
Yeah.
I put what you could choose from, and then also what most people use, because I think
Yeah.
that's important. It's like, well, there's CERN, but it's kind of new, and it's definitely like very like educational scientific market,
Yes.
where the engineering developer world has been like, well, like whatever like Arduino or SparkFun or Adafruit did.
Yeah. No, I say this from a place of love. The hardware license stuff is not fully mature yet.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
People are still figuring it out.
And the good news is, like, we, once in a while we tell this to folks who can handle this. It's
Yeah.
just like, hey, like, you can't really protect the hardware. Like,
Yeah.
it's all what you were saying. It's like, make it easy for the people who you want to see do stuff with, but like, it's essentially like buying something from the store and then taking off the cover and looking at the components. They can't stop you from doing
Yeah.
that. So that's the only analogy
Yep.
I can think of. SparkFun did an event at their headquarters. Then I did a thing about RepRap, which kind of started everyone.
Yeah.
We did a story about Adafruit. At the time, we were up to like 2.16 million orders. So once in a while, people say, well, I don't know any open source hardware companies that have sold, like, what's popular? And so I try to keep track of these things. So,
Yeah.
2 million orders, I think that's popular. I don't know.
That's popular in my
150,000
book.
printers.
Yeah. It's real numbers.
Yeah, I think there's more open source hardware out there than Microsoft Zunes. Just saying.
So true.
Nothing against Zune. I'm just saying, like, that would be considered a popular.
fact.
Yeah. We had photos of the first Arduino back in 2010. There was 13 companies, because I was keeping track of this when I was at Make, that were making at least $1 million, and at the time there was only one making over 10 million. Open Hardware 2010 at IBeam. This was the OG, the original gathering.
The one that's 10 years later will now
That's 10
be
years later.
Yeah.
the next one.
I used to do an open source hardware gift guide on Make every year, and it was easy because there was like 2 things. Then it turned into 20 things. Then it turned into thousands, and I couldn't do it anymore.
That's a great problem.
Yep. Chumby, one of the
yeah.
original products that got us all here. We had Bunny talking about this.
Yeah.
Mitch Altman, who did a closed source product, open sourced it, unlocked an entire career,
Yeah.
and turned hacker spaces into a thing we all know about now.
Yeah.
My crazy collection of logos over the years, which is never going to end.
Only lawyers like.
It's never going to end. And then we covered all the events
Yeah.
that were from the event page.
Yeah.
We did a project that showed the number of projects,
I love this.
how to do the certification, and more. The first open source hardware project that I physically was around, which was an open source MP3 player.
Yeah.
And this was before GitHub, before there was even a definition.
Yep.
Raphael is one of the original pioneers of open source hardware, currently at Gotenna,
Yeah.
which is another
Which is a great
newer
company. Yeah.
And then what is open source hardware? And we talked about the definition, and I kicked it off with your talk that was at the first summit. So
This is probably the most authoritative compendium of information about open source hardware on the internet.
yeah, I
This
think so.
month,
Yeah.
once a day.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I try, and I'm going to run out of time. So tomorrow is going to be this post
Yeah.
about us talking.
Yeah.
Osh Park,
Yeah.
which is the purple boards that everyone
Yep.
loves.
Open
Yep.
source hardware.
There's
Park.
also OH stencils. There's also Hackaday IO, and there's also a few more. So I'm going to try to squeeze them all in at once. And my wish list of what can happen in the next 10 years. I don't know if we'll have time, but I think hopefully there'll be enough interest for the next generation of hardware designers to carry the torch and work on things that none of us got to.
I think that's totally right.
And I think this event in March will be kind of, the way I look at it is there is a little bit of a handoff. Like, hey, new folks, we're running an Adafruit, and like we have our product line, we're always going to be open source. We're not going to get to the voting machine project. Sorry, got to the vomiting flashlight thing.
Hey,
probably don't have time to
most
do
of
a
the
voting
way.
machine. So I think,
Well, we can do what we do.
yeah, and I think just
prioritize.
and I think like being in a room together, it's like, hey, like what did you have to go through to get here, and like what did you not have time for? And I think that'd be helpful for the community.
Okay.
So, anyways, that's our show for tonight. We're going to do all of our other stuff tomorrow. We'll do
Yes,
new
we'll
products.
get the Python, new hardware. We should do sometime when we have a guest, we go over. Thank you for coming by.
Yeah.
Michael. It's
Thank
good
you.
to
I'm
see
sorry
you.
to displace other things.
No. You
Here-
displaced it with joy. I feel like we got to
I
everything.
wanted to have one segment that was just about open source hardware.
Yeah.
One, it saves me time for doing a post tomorrow. I'm just like, hey, check it out.
There we go.
But I wanted to make sure it had everything that you talked about with open source hardware,
Yeah.
all the work you've been doing with Oshawa,
Yeah.
the events,
Yeah.
and thank you for not giving legal advice.
Not legal advice.
No advice.
Good information,
but
good
person
information for
advice.
people
Yeah.
to also know where to get the information
Yes.
from.
Yes, it is out there. There are answers.
And kudos to you. A lot of
These
people
are questions with
advice.
answers. I know.
And you know what? There's a bunch of people who are in the chat who
Yeah.
I know, and they're doing hardware, and I know that they might have day jobs, they
Yeah.
might be doing other stuff, and they ask some of the questions I
Yeah.
funneled through, and I know that's really helpful because if they just listen to Twitter and they just listen to randos on mailing lists, they're going to get discouraged.
Yeah.
And so one of the things too, it's like if you're kind of miserable with open source software, or if you're miserable with open source hardware, look at the people that you're around and maybe find other people.
Yeah.
Go to
There's
the
so much
Discord.
joy in this
Yeah,
community.
there's a lot of good stuff going on.
There's a lot of people
But-
doing stuff.
but yeah.
We're very positive and we share and we're not.
But you have to be careful because like if you just live on mailing lists and like some of the like creakier like old places of open source, I think you're not going to be happy because they have a whole bunch of problems on their own.
Yeah.
And the point of hardware usually is for people to physically send something or be around each other. Like we come from the arts world, the crafts world, so it's just a different vibe. So if you're
Yeah.
if you're apprehensive about this stuff, don't get scared about people saying it's not open source enough. Don't fall for the purity tests. There is a guy that is going to email us tonight or tweet that Lemore doesn't really do open source.
Okay.
And it's,
I just deleted it. I don't even read it.
In addition to the elevator not having a firmware, but like Lemore has a Windows computer. You know, there's things like that, and I think that's the thing that don't listen to that.
No.
Rewind this and listen to all the other things,
Yeah.
and ship out the stuff. And there's
Should this, I mean, and look, the reality is, I think open source is amazing. It doesn't have to be the right answer to every question.
no
Right?
open
So
source
do it the
hardware is
way that
not
makes you happy.
Yeah, open like I don't. Yeah, we personally don't think all companies should do open source or
No.
open source hardware. It's not going to work for them.
No.
You have to figure out the reasons that you want to do it.
Yeah.
And for us, it's a fantastic business.
Absolutely.
This is great because you get an entire community of people that want to participate.
Yep.
And when you talk to marketers, they're like, how do we build a community? Like, how do we get influencers? Well, if people are doing pull requests and doing things to help your hardware, that's probably the most valuable community that you could ever wish for.
Totally.
They take ownership of your stuff and want to improve it.
Yeah.
So I think that's the thing that if you're on the fence, join in.
Yeah.
And
Try it out.
you have till March.
Yeah, submit a talk.
the
Submit a
event.
talk where the talk submissions are open. So if you want to talk about something that worked or something that didn't work,
Yeah, that's
or
just as
something
valuable.
amazing, submit the talk. Come on
Yeah.
down.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. That's our
Thanks,
show for tonight.
everybody.
And we'll post up this, and we'll see some of y'all tomorrow when
Okay.
we do our other things.
We'll do some small streams tomorrow for
Okay.
doing this. Thank you for coming by, Mike.
Thank you.
Here's your moment of Zener.
Bye.